Welcome inside the River's Edge Studios at Mr. Small's Theater in Millvale, Pennsylvania. I'm Matt Geica, and this is Geik's Got Game. Coming to you, if you're watching on the video stream, live on a Thursday evening. That's right, a little bit of a change here. Well, a big change here. It's rarely an evening show. We've only done this a couple of times, but I'll be out of town tomorrow, our normal time, Friday at 10. Not feasible for me to do live, but we'll have this audio stream, or this audio version of the program on the live stream tomorrow morning, Friday morning, at 10 o'clock. So you can catch it there. And as well, if you have stumbled upon the show right now, I want to welcome you to the program, maybe accessing a different audience in drive time on this pre-holiday Thursday. I am Matt Geica. This is my show. It's not your typical sports talk radio, or at least I don't think it is. Some days it's a little more conventional than others. Today might be more conventional than most, but I feel like there's a topic that is deserving of getting the full 1A treatment, the full A block treatment, if you will, here today, and that's Pens Caps from last night. So if you're here for hockey talk, if you like hockey, if you want to listen in and see what I have to say about this developing rivalry between the two teams in the Metropolitan Division that have combined to win the last 3 Stanley Cups, well, you've come to the right place, at least for the first half or so of this program. Brian Crawford's back in studio to engineer the show, and of course he hosts River Talk every week here on the River's Edge. And you can find all the programming at riversedgepgh.com. That's where you can locate the 24/7 audio stream. Mostly music, but some talk as well mixed in. We like to present the full palette of local talent here, both musical and, well, lyrical or literal, if you want to put it that way. You can find me on social media at Matt Geica on Twitter. That's MattGajTKA, and that's where I just tweeted out on this Thursday night the topics, a couple of the topics at least, for today's show. I'm also on Facebook, and that's where the video does stream on my professional page at Matt Geica Media, and it's just Matt Geica Media, easy to find right there. Also on the River's Edge page, of course. So a lot going on here, of course, as we lead into the holiday season. If you're Jewish, of course, the holiday season started a few weeks ago. So, well, maybe if you consider the Thanksgiving holiday to be part of it, which I suppose I do too. I think Thanksgiving might be our finest holiday as Americans. But if you do buy into that, then we've been in it for a while. I finally made my first trip out to the mall this year, my one annual day, to do a little bit of shopping away from my wife and my young son, so I can actually surprise them for once with something. It's nice to at least do that. I think giving gifts might have been overrated for a while, but now, with so much of us talking about experiences and not wanting material things, I still get a bit of joy as the giver of gifts. So I'm not going to apologize for that, and I'm not going to apologize for blowing some dough at the mall at Robinson this afternoon. But here we are, and hopefully my gift to you is some interesting sports and sports-ish talk for the next 55 minutes or so. Now, with regards to the Penguins and the Capitals, last night, 2-1 final in favor of the Penguins. They've now won 2 out of 3 in the season series. The first one went to overtime on opening night down at PPG Paints Arena. The previous 2 have been down at Capital One Arena in Washington. And after TJ Oshie scored the winner a few weeks back in regulation time, the Penguins got some vengeance there. And maybe it's just me, but I feel like there's so much more on the line now with Penguins and Caps in the regular season. Of course, they've met countless times in the playoffs. I believe it's 11 times now. And the Capitals have only been able to prevail twice. So you could even say there's not a lot of suspense in the playoffs, but we all know better. We all know that these games are up for grabs, and these series have been very close over the years. But in the regular season lately, at least over the past 5 or 6 years, I feel like the rivalry has lost some of its luster. And I know that the NHL continues to put these two teams, and did continue to put these two teams, on its spotlight games, whether it be the Wednesday night games. Used to be Wednesday night rivalry. Now it's just called Wednesday night hockey, which I like better on NBC Sports Network. Or the weekend tilts in the second half of the season that we always see, in that football time slot after the Super Bowl is over with. So clearly the league and general hockey fans are still intrigued by this rivalry, but I felt myself getting a little bit detached from it and getting fatigued with the redundancy of it, because the Penguins just continued to win when it counted. And they won in 2009, they won in 2016, they won in 2017, all those being second-round matchups in the Stanley Cup playoffs, and all 3 times the Pens went on to win the Stanley Cup. So at this time last year, when it was 5 Stanley Cups to 0, and when, for all intents and purposes, the Crosby-Ovechkin era had been totally one-sided when you look at team success. And I know I'm reducing it way down beyond what I should. Of course, there's Evgeny Malkin on the Penguins side and Nick Backstrom on the Capitals side. If you want to pick a third member of each team as part of this feud, you'd probably say Chris Letang on the Penguins side, and Braden Holtby, I guess, would be the longer-tenured Capital, the guy with the most history. Since Marc-Andre Fleury's out of town, of course, he's off the list there, but he has played a large role in this battle, and that's why it was so fun to see him go up against the Caps last year in the Stanley Cup final. But until this past spring, in that Stanley Cup final, where the Caps finally broke through, I just wasn't feeling it anymore. I didn't get that same excitement. I was starting to wonder, is this still the Penguins' biggest rival? And for some of you, the Flyers have always been the Penguins' biggest rival. And I think I still agree with that. I feel like I still lean toward Pens-Flyers being the biggest rivalry in Penguins land, just because of the history that is shared going back 50 years. Both teams came in at the same time. The Flyers were dominant in the 70s and for the early part of the 80s. Then the Penguins started to get frisky. They won a couple of Stanley Cups. They became legit contenders. The Flyers, though, still had their number in the playoffs until the 2008 postseason when the Penguins got the better of them. So 08, 09, and just last year, the Penguins have won 3 out of the past 4 playoff matchups there. So that's been more of a give and take, Penguins and Flyers. And I think the Flyers still have a sizable edge in regular season results. But overall, I think both fan bases would agree that each side has gotten some shots in over the years, in some cases literal as well as metaphorical. But for the Capitals, until last year, they were playing the perennial little brother to the Pens. So it wasn't, I can't imagine, that fun for them to continue to play these games and not have anything that they could really hold over Penguins fans' heads. And I'm sure if you looked in your heart of hearts, Penguins fans, you weren't as excited about it as you were perhaps in 09 or even in 16 when the teams got back together for the first time in 7 years in the postseason, and the Penguins hadn't won anything in the playoffs for 7 years. So there was more at stake there with the 2 Stanley Cups and with the Capitals being roadkill on the road to those Stanley Cups. There was probably a little bit lost, or maybe a lot lost in my case, from the outside watching this. And I don't know if the players feel the same way. It's hard to get an honest answer from them in this, and I covered the Pens for 2.5 years. So I got a chance to be a part of the run-up to regular season games against the Caps and postseason games against the Caps in 2017, more specifically. And it's tough to tell if they felt like it was still, the height of excitement to play the Capitals from the Penguins' perspective, and vice versa for the Caps to play the Pens. But you look at the games on the ice, and they didn't have that same emotion until, I think, this year. And you look especially at last night, and well, there's plenty of extracurricular stuff. Of course, the Jamie Oleksiak, Tom Wilson fight in the opening minute. I'm not one to get excited about fights anymore. I've gotten past that as a hockey fan. I feel like we should all be past that. But it's still a tangential part of the game. It's not a huge part of the game anymore. But you probably figured that Wilson was going to go after Oleksiak after the comments from Jim Rutherford during last year's playoffs, where he said that Wilson ran and hid when Oleksiak challenged him after Wilson put Zach Aston-Reese out for the remainder of the playoffs with a jaw injury, with a broken jaw. I shouldn't minimize it there, and also a concussion. So you knew that with Wilson playing in this season series for the first time last night after getting past that, a 16-game suspension for a preseason incident, you knew there was going to be something last night, and there was. But beyond that, there was the pushing and shoving was back after whistles, and I don't think that's necessary to have a great hockey game, don't get me wrong, but you could just tell there was more emotion involved. Crosby and Ovechkin were jawing at each other during that aftermath of the Oleksiak-Wilson fight, which Wilson clearly won, of course, with that one-punch KO. So a scary moment there, I think, and probably sobered things up a little bit, but the intensity ratcheted right back up after that, and it was a tight game throughout. Not maybe the high-scoring games we're used to in Pens Capitals over the years, and of course 7-6 was the final in the opening night game earlier this year at PPG Paints. This one 2-1, Crosby getting a couple of points, Brian Rust scoring the game winner so he stays hot, and a myriad close calls in the third period. The new guy, Marcus Pettersson, the defenseman, clearing a puck off the goal line where it looked like Yevgeny Kuznetsov was about to sneak one through Matt Murray. and tie the game late in the third period. A couple of opportunities for the Capitals just barely missed. Actually, several just barely missed. They missed the net and also had 2 or 3 come inches away from tying the score. So I wouldn't say it was the greatest game ever for Matt Murray, but a better game for him, and it led to a more competitive game throughout as Murray and his teammates held the fort, and the Penguins won and gained, I think, an emotional step up on this season where they have struggled to find their reason for existence. And that may sound silly, of course. They're playing hockey for a living. It's a kid's game. You should be able to motivate yourself. But as I've said multiple times this fall and now into the winter, as we get close to it, this Penguins team has been to the mountaintop, so I find they have trouble. They've been to the mountaintop twice in recent years, so I find they have trouble, or at least the veteran players do, fully engaging in games. Well, now, with the Capitals having the Stanley Cup, with the whole Tom Wilson thing, of course, being part of the rivalry and that being just barely below the surface as last night's game started, there was plenty to get excited about if you were a Penguin. And also, that matter of the standings and the Penguins not being anywhere near secure in playoff position as we approach the midway point of the season. So even though they're still 5 points behind the Capitals in the Metropolitan Division after last night's win, that was a good one to get to keep them in the top 3 in the Metro, tied with the surprising Islanders, and also ensure that they keep the positive feelings going. Now the Penguins have won 6 of their past 10, and they've gotten points in 7 of their last 10, and they'll play tonight, Thursday night, if you are watching live on this video stream. It's just a couple of hours away as they'll host the Minnesota Wild. A busy stretch here. I believe they have the Rangers and the Hurricanes coming up too before the holiday break. So those are 2 teams directly behind them in the Metro Division standings. Plenty of motivation here, and the excuse that they have a hard time getting going in the first half, it's starting to wear thin. And so perhaps last night's game against the Capitals will help boost them. I know it felt bigger to me as a fan, and it's just really interesting how this matchup has evolved over the years. Both teams were pretty much on level footing when Sid and Ovi came into the league together in 2005-06. They both basically rose together. The Penguins got the Stanley Cup in 2009, and then both had frustrations in the playoffs after that. So they were pretty level until those back-to-back cups in 16 and 17, and now it's starting to feel like they are pretty level again, and I think that's the best type of a rivalry, not a big brother, little brother situation, which we have had at times over the course of this matchup. I think it's more fun when the 2 teams are peers, and I think we have that again, so that's terrific. And also, I like to see Sid and Ovi get into it from the trash-talking perspective, as we saw last night. And even Crosby, after the final buzzer and talking to NBC's Pierre Maguire, Pierre asking him about the verbal confrontation between he and Ovi, and he said, I was just wondering why Tom Wilson didn't get an instigator penalty on the Alexiak fight, which is reasonable. And then he said, I don't know why Ovechkin was talking to me. I came here to win a game, not talk to him. So you can tell there is an edge there. And that's about as far as Sid will go. The eminently polite Sidney Crosby, the eminently reserved Sidney Crosby, at least in the public eye. You know he's not going to say, yeah, I hate Ovechkin. I wish he'd go to hell. I wish he'd burn in hell. He's not going to say anything like that. And, Ovi might not say anything similar because he doesn't want to give the impression that Crosby's in his head at all. But there is that edge, and it might be more sharpened now after Ovechkin finally gets his cup. And maybe Sid's thinking, okay, I got to put this guy back in his place. I got to put this team in red back in their place. And, good luck with that. It'll probably take another championship and maybe another playoff series win for the Penguins against the Caps to fully do that. But it's fun to see the stakes rise again. And so that really made last night enjoyable for me. What about you? What do you think? Let me know on Twitter. Again, at Matt Gajtka, last name spelled Gajtka. Let me know on Facebook at Matt Gajtka Media. I always like to see the interaction there. And I see plenty of folks watching live. You're probably wondering, what is this, Thursday night instead of Friday morning? Well, schedules change, and we got to squeeze it in when we can. I'm not going to be available next week, so couldn't go 2 weeks in a row without a Gike Scott game, and I hope you feel the same way. Okay, later on in today's show, more hockey talk, kind of, as I reminisce on an important event for young Matt Gajtka 20 years ago. My dad took me to my first live hockey game, and my life was not the same after that. I'm wondering if you have a similar experience. So I'll relate some details, and boy, are the memories still vivid, despite me being 20 years along from that. In fact, a couple of days from now will be the exact 20-year anniversary of my true beginning to a love story with hockey that continues to this day. Also, what's your best sports moment of 2018? I know what it is for me, and it has nothing to do with Pittsburgh sports, which you might not be surprised about since, of course, there were no championships, and around here we're used to those big playoff type moments. Those were in short supply in 2018, so I went a little bit off the board with this one, not a team sport moment. And this moment in question also has me looking forward to 2019 even more than I enjoy reminiscing on this year. Also, later, a local athlete who plays for a local college, near and dear to my heart, was drafted by the pros and made history in that regard. I'll give you the details there. And to close the show, I'll have a tribute to a friend of mine who passed away this past week, a huge Pittsburgh sports fan, and just the events of the last 7 days made me think that he was looking down and maybe nudging the scales or tipping the scales a little bit in favor of two black and gold teams he was especially fond of. This is Geiks Got Game. I am Matt Geika. You are watching/listening to The River's Edge. We'll be back in one moment or two.
Dun, dun, da, 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 dun, dun, da, 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 da. It's 2017. We've cleaned shit up here in Pittsburgh. Something that the governor has done that is just, it's got me giddy. I want money from Hempfield. That's what I want. Give us your cash. But why would you put trees up in front of a restaurant that views the river? If I'm going to a river-viewing restaurant, I want to actually view the river. Am I crazy?
Catch River Talk with Brian Crawford, Mondays at 10 a.m. here on the River's Edge.
This is the real shit, folks.
Back inside Mr. Small's Theater, the upper room at Mr. Small's Theater. I'm Matt Geika. This is my show. It's Geiks Got Game, and it's on the River's Edge. We're live on a Thursday night, and coming to you on tape delay on the audio stream if you are listening on Friday morning, 10 to 11, but it doesn't really matter. I try not to make it that timely and that specific to the time frame and the time slot that it would make things sound a little bit weird right now. So I'm not going to talk about either tonight or last night's game against the Minnesota Wild from a Penguins perspective. I suppose it's all about your perspective, right? If you are listening now or in the future. That sounds very mysterious. Like I said before the break, I've been a diehard hockey fan for about 20 years now, and the moment that turned the corner for me, that really put the sport at the top of the list ahead of everything else, and hockey has remained undefeated and unchallenged at the top of my personal hierarchy ever since 1998. Well, the one moment that did that was seeing a hockey game live, and you hear that a lot from hockey fans. There's no better sport live, and even I challenged that a couple of weeks ago, you might remember, here in the era of high def and the desire to have a replay at your disposal. It's a little bit tougher to have that full-fledged multimedia experience in the building, but at the same time, I don't disagree that hockey is the best live experience. But you may say it's baseball, and I wouldn't necessarily have a huge disagreement with you there. You may say it's football. You may say it's soccer. I think we can all agree that having that experience and being there in the flesh is pretty important, though. When it comes to appreciating the sport, I think it's a lot easier to appreciate the sport as it is, the full scope of it, when you are right there in the house or at the field or whatever it may be. So the moment for me where I went from interested in hockey, which I was previous to that, as a 13-year-old going on 14. So right in that time frame when sports fandom really does tend to rise up in the hearts and minds of all of us, or most of us who are exposed to it at that age. I'd been watching the Penguins on TV. I was actually roped in late in the 1997-98 season, the first year without Mario. So I didn't know Mario in his first coming, if you will. I knew the Penguins captained by Ron Francis that first year, and then Jaromir Jagr took over the captaincy, and he became my favorite player quickly in 1998-99. Pretty interesting year for the Pens. You may recall they went on to just barely squeak into the playoffs, keeping their streak alive of making the Stanley Cup tournament. And then they upset the Devils, the number one seeded Devils, in the first round. And some huge goals in that series from Jagr, from Martin Straka, from German Titov, and Alexei Kovalev, and all these names of past Penguins vintage. So that was the team that made me a hockey fan. And it went over the top On December 22nd, 1998, Penguins hosted the Kings at the old barn. It was still called Civic Arena. We were still, about a year and a half from getting the corporate name of Mellon Arena, but we all knew it is the Igloo, right? And my dad, if he is watching or listening right now, thanks again for that, Dad, or if it was Mom's idea, I don't know. But at any rate, it was a father-son night, and we took the pickup truck up from Weirton, West Virginia. Boy, does that play to type from the Mountain State side of things. Made the 45-minute ride, though, on Route 22 to the Parkway West, down through the tunnels, and as always, excited about seeing the skyline, but I was even more excited than usual because we were seeing a Penguins game live. And the result of the game didn't exactly deliver on the hype. The Penguins lost 3-0. They scored a goal, or at least it looked like they scored a goal in the second period, but diehard hockey fans from that era will remember the old skate in the crease rule. It was waved off. I believe Stu Barnes scored the goal, but someone had their skate in the blue paint, and at that time, that was considered to be goaltender interference, and that was considered to be a black and white issue. If on video review they saw that an attacking player had his skate in the crease and he wasn't the player who scored the goal, well, then the goal was wiped off. It was a terrible rule, and they got rid of it, in fact, going into the next season, after the huge controversy in the Stanley Cup Final when Brett Hull scored while he was trying to collect the puck around the crease. There was a controversy there as he scored against Dominik Hasek. The Stars beat the Sabres in overtime in Game 6. Buffalo fans are still pissed off about that one, of course. I've even seen a license plate up in Western New York that says no goal, and I know exactly what they're talking about from that game 20 years ago. But even that pedantic rule from the NHL back in those days, that couldn't ruin the night for me. Seeing those hockey heroes that I've been watching only on TV in person and experiencing the rise and the fall of the emotion in the crowd, it's experiencing the game and all the sights and the sounds. I think sounds of hockey are underrated. The sound of a shot hitting the post, of skates cutting through the ice surface, of players slamming on the brakes, of goalies kicking pucks out to the corner, that big thud, or the pop that goes with a blocker save. It's all there. Sometimes you can even hear the players yelling to each other, both from the bench to the ice and on the ice to the opponents. So it was all perfect. Even the smells of the old Civic Arena, the old nacho cheese and the popcorn. So it was terrific, as you can tell from my experience there. It was extremely indelible. I still remember it well to this day. And my dad and I still joke about this diehard LA Kings fan who was there at the entrance as we were milling into the front door, and he had a kingly robe, if you will, and a big crown, and it said LA across the back. So we even saw a Kings superfan several thousand miles away from Los Angeles. So it was everything I would expect it to be and more, with the exception of the final score and the fact the Penguins didn't get a single goal back in that era. And in fact, that era continues all the way through today. They don't get shut out a lot, and especially not at home. So I suppose I was unlucky in that way, but I was hooked. I was addicted hopelessly from that moment, and we went on to take advantage of the Mario Lemieux sponsored family section. He was the owner then, not a player, or not owner/player, but just an owner. And so my mom, my dad, myself, my brother, we went up to several games after that, and the rest is history. So that is the moment that I can say I became a hockey fan for life. Is there a moment that perhaps you remember from whether it be your childhood, early adulthood, maybe your mom or dad took you to a game, or maybe you went by yourself, went with a relative or some friends? I also remember my first live Steelers game. It was one of the final games in the history of the old Three Rivers Stadium, in fact. It was Steelers and Bengals, and then I saw the final game at Three Rivers against the Washington Professional Football Club, and those are moments I don't forget, obviously. I went to Pirates games even before that first Penguins game. Those don't stand out as much to me. I wasn't a huge sports fan before about age 12. But it is funny how those things just have that higher stature in the mind's eye, even to this day, and I'm sure I'll remember that all the way until the day I die. And it's been 2 decades, so I don't expect that memory to fade anytime soon. We'll take a break here on Geiks Got Game, and I'll see if you did leave anything in the comments section. Also, I want to talk about, as I mentioned, a local athlete makes history in the sport of hockey, and a Pirates off-season update. Nothing much to talk about, but still at this point, I feel the obligation, especially with PNC Park sitting right behind me there on the screen. I do want to talk a little baseball, in addition to some Steelers, too. That's all mixed in to the rest of this hour. This is Gike's Got Game on the River's Edge.
Hey, it's Mike Sasson. Guess what? You used to love us at 10. You're going to love us even more at 9. It's me. It's Alex. It's funniness. It's guests. It's all sorts of me yelling into microphones only 1 hour earlier. It's exactly what you need at 9 o'clock. It's like a shot of adrenaline. It's the Mike Sasson Show. Now starting at 9 o'clock on Tuesday on the River's Edge, a new kind of radio.
Good Thursday evening or Friday morning. Alternatively, this is Gike's Got Game. I am Matt Geica, and we're moving on to the third period of today's show. And thank you to all the folks watching on Facebook Live on this Thursday night. John Billigan checks in. He wants to know how I was doing. I appreciate that, John, very much. Jared Wickerham is causing a stir in the comments, as he sometimes does. Facetiously, he says the moment that changed his life in live sports is meeting me a few years ago. His life has not been the same since, he says. So we'll take his word for it. Jared also suggests, to give you an idea where his head's at tonight, that I should wear an all-green bodysuit. So it's just my head floating here in front of the green screen. Don't give away all the tricks of television or of video, Jared. My goodness. People don't know that's not really PNC Park behind me, or maybe they do. I'm not sure. I don't know how much credit to give the viewer at this point. Also, Mark Jarobi, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, chimes in. He's enjoying the show. So, yeah, we're seeing some different faces and some different avatars, if you will, on this Thursday night edition. So, yeah, we're hitting a different demographic here. And as an addendum to the previous segment, I should mention that my wife and I took our son Lucas to his first live Penguins game just a few weeks back. It was, in fact, the traditional day before Thanksgiving home game for the Penguins. They've played countless times on that day. I think it's somewhere up over 40 in their 50-plus years of existence. So, yes, it has been a tradition, a legit one, as much as you can get it in the tough world of pro sports scheduling. And the Penguins dominated the Dallas Stars. You may recall that night. They broke out of a slump, so I'll give Lucas some credit for that. Unfortunately, unlike my 13-year-old self, I doubt Lucas remembers one moment from that game. So that's why when I asked, what's your first memorable live sports experience, I used the word memorable because for him, for his first live sports experience, it was at PNC Park 2 summers ago when he was just, 1.5. So, or actually, he was less than 1 year old when we first took him to a game, come to think of it, and he went to several this past summer before he turned 2. So those aren't memorable unless he does surprise us at some point. He is the boy wonder. Maybe he will. So the first one for me was that Penguins-Kings game from back in the day. And I wonder if any of you out there do have a similar type of a memory on something or some moment that put you over the top and got you addicted to this drug that we call spectator sports. So anyway, in this third period of today's show, let's take a skate around the Pittsburgh sports landscape. I do want to relay some news from Moon Township, Robert Morris University, where, full disclosure, I do work in the media relations department, but I work for the men's hockey team. There was some news from the women's hockey team, which is off to a nice start, leading its conference and challenging some of the top teams in the country. It's been a pretty exciting first half, in fact, for the RMU women, who have been very good for now 3 seasons running. But one of their senior co-captains, her name is Maggie Legue. She's from Vermont. She was just drafted today by the National Women's Hockey League, by the Connecticut Whale, in the 5th round of the 2018 NWHL draft. So Legue becomes the second Colonial to be drafted into the All-Women's Pro League. Brittany Howard, who graduated just this past spring and had all the offensive records at RMU, she was drafted as well by the Buffalo Beauts 2 years ago, but she ended up signing with the Canadian Women's Hockey League. So perhaps Legue could make her own kind of history if she does go on to play for Connecticut after her collegiate career is done. If she does go to play for the team that drafted her in the NWHL, that would be a first in the history of the women's program over at RMU down at Neville Island. However, Legue is just the latest in a series of former Colonials to at least be connected to the NWHL, so she could have a chance to be the 7th RMU player to skate in that league. Goaltender Miri Räisänen, who was an Olympic bronze medalist, in fact, at the Pyeongchang Games this past winter for Team Finland. She has signed with the Connecticut Whale this season, and she joined former USA Olympian Brianne McLaughlin and also former member of the RMU men's or women's hockey staff, Kelly Stedman. They also played for Buffalo, winning a league championship a couple of years ago. Morgan Beekrich and Ashley Vesey. Also Rebecca Vint. All those names have gone from RMU to the NWHL. So congratulations to Maggie, and we're all pulling for you to make it to the top level of the sport. Pretty interesting stuff. And if you do get a chance to check out the women's game down at the Island, I suggest you do. We did have one regular season game for the NWHL played up at the Lemieux Sports Complex in Cranberry, and the league's All-Star game came to Cranberry as well just this past spring. So it seems like the league is testing the waters to perhaps have an expansion team in Pittsburgh, PA. So we'll see about that. Football news, you probably already know this if you have a pulse and you live in Pittsburgh. The Steelers beat the Patriots. Newsflash. The Steelers beat the Patriots this past Sunday in a thrilling game, thrilling finish. The type of game they typically don't win against the Pats. And if you need a previous example, just go back to last year. You could say that the referees and the officials and the NFL in general took that one away from the Steelers. And you may not get that big of an argument from me, but last year, a continuation of the trend. I talked about rivalries and big brother, little brother, that dynamic. That lopsided nature of the Steelers-Pats rivalry is why I haven't been that interested in it in recent years. And I have felt like a Caps fan probably felt back before they won their first Stanley Cup when they played the Penguins. So, again, it's more interesting when little brother rises up and when the team that's been downtrodden makes a statement like the Steelers did this past week. Hey, they were on the ropes, to use another awful sports cliche, but I'll do it here. It was appropriate. If they lost, they were probably out of the playoffs, and they still might not make the playoffs, but the Steelers saved their season. Pretty classic night game at Heinz Field. So if you like pro football, I'm sure you were enthralled by that one last Sunday. Anytime Pittsburgh beats New England, it's a story. It has happened, believe it or not, just not in the playoffs this century. Not in the playoffs in the Tom Brady era, at least, and very rarely in the regular season. I believe this is only the third regular season win for the Steelers against the Patriots. Third or fourth win against the Patriots for Pittsburgh since Tom Brady came into the league back in 2001. Brian Crawford, may I bring you in?
Sure.
Did you have any reaction to that result at Heinz Field? It's almost like you're in an alternate reality.
Yeah, I was shocked. I remember, I didn't get to watch it because I was sleeping, and then I had my show, and I ran into work, and I'm like, oh, it's Sunday. I bet the Steelers played. So I pulled out my watch, and I said, I mentioned the S word,
Yes.
and I said, what's the Steelers score?
Uh-huh.
And it came up that the Steelers had beaten the Patriots, and I thought, wow, really?
Yeah.
It was a shock. It completely threw me off because I just immediately assumed that the Steelers would lose that game.
I think most of us did. In fact, I don't know if you saw this, the first sports bet at Rivers Casino was some guy putting $1,000 on the Pats to cover the spread this past weekend. So very appropriate first bet in the history of the new sports book down there at the Point. And that person did not cash in. So, I feel bad. I also would say it was probably a good business decision for that individual, just because of the recent history. And I'm not one, Brian, to buy into voodoo and curses and all that. In very rare cases, maybe the players are thinking about it during the game, but I don't think it affects the players nearly as much as it does the fans. So that's why I discount it. But in this case, I think there was something to it. There was some sort of a mental hold, if you will. And so for me, that did add to the newsworthiness of it, to the total shock of the moment. It wasn't necessarily because the Patriots are that good this year. They might not be. They've been pretty shaky. But hey, so were the Steelers. So I wasn't expecting anything great.
Yeah, and you brought up a point that I was going to mention that, yeah, they beat the Patriots, but let's be honest, this isn't their best year. We're not looking at the Patriots at their best. We're looking at the Patriots in like you said, a shaky year. But to your point, so are the Steelers. It's kind of hit or miss with them. Yeah, there seems to be something in the background, and I agree. Usually we as fans and analysts and things like that make a much bigger deal out of things like these long-term rivalries and who's inside of whose head. But in this particular case, it does seem like it's something. Now, some fans would argue that it's easy to get the advantage and get into someone's head when you've got the tapes.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a totally different story
Yeah.
altogether. Forget getting inside your opponent's head. How about getting inside your opponent's playbook? That's a completely different level. So,
But I think Bill Belichick
I think
kind of...
that era has passed.
I agree, yeah, but people will still bring that up. But I think Bill Belichick does a great job of getting inside of people's heads, where he'll bring in former Steelers, like when James Harrison left and they picked him up immediately. Do you really think that the Patriots needed James Harrison, or do you think that was more of just picking up a guy because they thought they could stick it to the Steelers and keep pushing that rivalry? And
A little of both, probably.
Yeah.
Because remember, he did play pretty well for them at the
He
end of
did,
last
yeah.
season. So let's not discount that factor that he still had something left in the tank. But I'm sure of it. And we've seen that over the years. They have signed players, and it's not just against the Steelers they've done it. They've done it against other teams in their division as well, where they'll release a player and the Patriots all magically they have an interest in this guy because they're playing that team coming up. So there might be some intelligence to be gained. You're right about Belichick. He has such a reputation of, I've heard it referred to as this, playing with one hand tied behind your back, or your right hand tied behind your back if that is your strong hand. He makes you do things you don't want to do on the field tactically, or at least his teams typically do. So yes, that can make you think a little bit more if you are a team, if you are a coach and a coaching staff, especially, or a quarterback. And I wouldn't say Roethlisberger had his best game, but he definitely outplayed Tom Brady last week. And when's the last time we could say that in a head-to-head matchup? I don't know if ever. One of those wins that the Steelers have against the Pats this century was when Matt Castle was quarterback, when Brady had a blown-out knee. So it's only happened very rarely, so I understand the revelry there, even though the season is still up for grabs. If the Ravens win a couple of games here, it's not going to matter. But I haven't talked much about the Steelers here this year, but I just felt it necessary. You have to bring that up when something like that happens.
from my understanding, too, the offensive line for the Steelers played really, really well
they
this
did.
past Sunday. And that's something that Tom Brady has generally had behind him, is this incredible offensive line. I wonder if maybe the two quarterbacks would have a more even record if Ben Roethlisberger played behind the offensive line that Tom Brady has enjoyed through much of his career.
Yeah, that's a good call, too. Remember when the Steelers won their last Super Bowl in 2009, Roethlisberger was running for his life every down, it seemed like. So he made it happen despite them. And now that's what leads to people like me to say, well, they've wasted the back end of Ben's prime because they do have a good offensive line. They do have maybe the best receiver in the game. I know Antonio Brown's had a down year, but they do have all these advantages and all these really talented players, and it just hasn't happened. I don't know if it's going to happen this year, but at the very least, they have a feather in their cap if they do go into the offseason quietly, and, of course, to be continued on that. I also wanted to ask you, do you have like a formative sports moment that stands out in your head as a really good time and something that made you want to fall in love with either that sport in general or in particular or sports in general?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a particular moment, but I will say it's a particular time in my life. So I was always into sports or interested in sports, but when I started covering the Cal U Vulcans out of 91.9 WCAL and actually going on a regular basis to games throughout southwestern Pennsylvania, particularly in Rostraver at the Ice Garden, you really grew an appreciation for the game and really fell in love with it. And I feel like the Ice Garden is a great place to get that experience. I haven't been there since they've remodeled it, but I know at least back in the day, you could walk and stand right up next to the glass. It's such an old building that it's often colder in the middle of winter when it's 20 degrees out. It's colder inside the Ice Garden than it is outside. And it just has this old community hockey feel to it. One time there was an issue on the ice and the Zamboni broke, and they had to bring in a pickup truck to tow the Zamboni off of the ice. So you get this real community feel to it. Again, I don't know if maybe it's changed. I haven't been there since they've remodeled it, but just being there and being in that atmosphere and seeing the Cal U homecoming with the musicians there and the cheer squad and everything, and just bringing the entire university down to the Ice Garden and having that really awesome experience, I think just really made me especially appreciate college hockey, which growing up in this area until recently with the rise of RMU and everything, there hasn't been much of a focus on college hockey, and I still feel like it's not as much as it could be or as it should be because people are so into the Penguins.
We're working on it. Yeah.
Yeah. You guys are
I
doing
will
a
say
great
that
job.
much, yeah.
Well, I think you guys are doing a fantastic job, and I think you're, especially with the popularity of the Penguins, it's hard to get in there, but I feel like you guys are doing it. You hear about RMU all the time. But really being in that atmosphere, and then even also in a similar situation, being at the Three Rivers Classic, watching the RMU versus Penn State game, it just showed you how special college hockey was and how different it was from an atmospherical perspective than a professional game, because there's so many different elements that a professional team just doesn't have. I think it's so much more fun to watch a band play in between
The
different
band
plays.
is big. I will say that much.
versus just playing something on the speaker system.
Recorded music. Well, you talk about Cal U, that's club hockey too, and that's
It
an
is.
entirely different atmosphere or an entirely different realm as well compared to varsity hockey. So there's a couple different levels there too.
And it really got me into women's hockey too, covering the Cal U women. They
There
were
you
actually
have it.
my favorite team to cover because they and also the second men's team, but the women's team especially, they just were so open to being on the air and better at communicating, and it was a lot of fun to watch them play. And you realize how aggressive the women's teams are, how much fun it is to watch. They're just as exciting as the men's teams, in my opinion.
There's no hitting, but it's definitely physical. And,
Yeah.
well, there's no intentional hitting allowed. And I had that question. My dad, in fact, went to a Army women's game a couple of weeks ago, and he said, they're not allowed to hit, right? And I said, yeah, but I would equate it to basketball in that way because you can, there's a lot of contact. It's a contact sport. It's not a hitting sport, but it is a contact sport. So there could be a misconception on that. And if you've watched Olympic hockey, you know how dynamic the women's game can be from a skill and speed perspective,
yeah.
too. So there you have it. All right. Thank you, Brian.
Absolutely.
I appreciate the input as always. Brian Crawford, host of River Talk here on the River's Edge. One last thing before we go to our final break on Geiks Got Game. The Pirates, yes, they still exist, and there was a report or two that they might make a splash free agency signing, at least a splash from a name perspective, maybe not necessarily a production perspective, but I'm sure if you've watched baseball over the past decade, you know the name Troy Tulowitzki. I know Clint Hurdle does because Tulowitzki was his star rookie shortstop when the Colorado Rockies went all the way to the World Series in 2007, already 11 years ago. Yikes. But Tulowitzki is available on the open market. He's being pursued by the Pirates. I heard the Brewers were interested too. Tulo, as they call him, is working out in Arizona currently and trying to show off his stuff and show he's healthy. He hasn't really been able to get on the field and stay on the field for about a year and a half. So take it with a grain of salt, but as my former colleague Tim Williams of Pirates Prospects put it this week on Twitter, it might be a good combination of name recognition for Pirates fans, and we all know it's an entertainment business. That's all part of it. And also a guy who has a decent chance to show some upside. And the Pirates have lost their shortstop officially of the past few seasons. Jordy Mercer has signed with the Detroit Tigers, and 1 year, $5.5 million were the terms on that contract. All the best to Jordy. A great dude and a pretty darn good ball player, I would say. So the Pirates do have a hole at shortstop. I'm not sure they have someone to step right in and be as productive as Jordy was. Not that he was great, but definitely competent, and I would say average across the board. An average at the big league level is nothing to be sneezed at. So if it's Tulowitzki or if it's someone else, I suppose time will tell here, as the baseball offseason really isn't that exciting anymore from a free agency perspective because teams have figured out that paying these guys past their primes doesn't make any sense. Call it collusion if you want, and some athletes and agents especially have alleged that, or just call it smart management. But the big action comes with trades. We've seen a few of those, of course, and maybe the Pirates will be involved in some trades again this offseason. As it stands right now, though, Troy Tulowitzki is the biggest excitement surrounding the Pittsburgh Baseball Club, unless you're a big fan of Jordan Lyles, who the Buccos signed to be a rotation candidate, taking the place of the traded Ivan Nova. He was dealt to the White Sox, if you missed that, a couple of weeks ago. And like I said, with the hot stove not really being a thing as much anymore, and especially here in Pittsburgh, where the Pirates don't often make big news unless it's trading a big star, I don't hold it against you if you weren't quite as locked in to the MLB offseason as maybe some other fan bases are out there. Okay, time for overtime after this break. On Geiks Got Game, we'll listen to some River's Edge music and bring it on back with a tribute to a good friend of mine who's sadly no longer with us, but I know my life was changed from getting to know him, and I know he definitely would have enjoyed this week very much if he were still here on this planet, and if he's watching from somewhere else. Not going to rule that out. I bet he really did have a good time seeing the outcomes, a couple of them that took place on the sporting fields and the ice surfaces on which the Pittsburgh teams do their work. Coming up after this break.
Are you hungry for science? I'm Carissa Sedor.
And I'm Ralph Crew.
And we host the Carnegie Science Center's podcast, Science News and Cues.
Also known as Snack.
Join us twice a month as we talk about exciting science news, answer science questions submitted by listeners, that's you, and dive deep into a cool topic every episode.
Curious about exoplanets, glowing animals, or even your own poop? Well, do we have the show for you?
We also feature special guests from octopuses to famous YouTube science stars to NASA scientists.
Join us on Snack, and remember,
Stay
hungry for science.
I dedicate this edition of Geiks Got Game to a friend of mine who has passed on from this earth. His name is Lance Fry. I met him this past spring at a Penguins game. Bring it full circle, of course. Down at PPG Paints Arena in one of the luxury boxes, and he deserved every bit of that luxury that he was experiencing that day. It was actually Penguins Capitals, come to think of it, late last regular season. I was covering the game for Pittsburgh Hockey Now, and Lance was there at his first live hockey game in quite some time as the guest of a nonprofit called CC Champions. CC Champions' mission is to connect kids who are terminally ill or at least severely ill with people in their profession of choice or people that they look up to in the professional realm. And it's meant to be aspirational, meant to be uplifting for the kid. I found it just as uplifting for myself to meet a young man who, first of all, wanted to meet me and also Seth Rorabaugh, I should mention. He joined me in our little trip down to the box at intermission as we stepped from our press box perch to see Lance and his family. So Seth and I met Lance, and Lance and I kept in touch after that. I would visit with him. I saw him once or twice away from Children's Hospital, where he continued to get treatments for an advancing form of blood cancer, and he was in a heck of a fight, to put it mildly. He had a heart transplant about 4 years prior to me meeting him at the age of 17, and it was meant to correct a congenital heart defect that he was battling for his entire life. So a heart transplant, that's about as big as it gets, right? That's as big of a trauma that you can go through from a medically induced perspective. And Lance got through it. Lance had a great, I want to say he had a great personality. He had an uplifting personality. I use that word again deliberately because it was very true. He was such a huge fan of the Penguins and the Steelers and even the Pirates too, even though he professed to not being a big baseball follower. But I think he played the whatever the MLB The Show edition video game that's out this year. He played that, so he knew all the players in every roster, it seemed like, in baseball, in addition to, of course, hockey and football. And the two of us would often talk about Pittsburgh sports, and he would ask me about my experiences talking to guys and covering the Penguins especially. The Penguins were his number one, and the Steelers were pretty close behind. He was usually always wearing some sort of a Pittsburgh sports jersey or a bit of paraphernalia when I visited him on the Hart floor at Children's Hospital. And, of course, with my experience with our son Lucas and his first 2 weeks of life we spent at Children's Hospital in the NICU there. That's the neonatal intensive care unit, for those of you not familiar with that. And be grateful if you don't know those letters and what they mean right offhand like I do. But it was a scary moment for us, and I'm sure for Lance and for his family, especially his mom Betsy, who I got to know pretty well. I'm sure it was scary to go in there every time, but also the chemo treatments, even though they weakened him, even though they sapped his energy, they were also life-giving. So I knew there was a paradox there. So I saw Lance about 4 or 5 times over the course of the last 9 months. Well, I got a call from Lance a couple of weeks ago. He and his mom were on speakerphone. It was a Sunday morning. He texted before to ask if it was okay to call me. So I feared the worst. And I did get the worst news. Well, not the worst, because he still had a couple of weeks left, as it turned out. But he said that the doctors at Children's were stopping treatment because the cancer had advanced and it had spread throughout his body, and the latest chemo did not do enough to head off the cancerous cells. So, barring a miracle or some miracle treatment, that was going to be it for him. So he and his family were trying to jam all these events into this month. They bumped up a cruise that they were going to take, and they bumped up a trip that they were going to take to Los Angeles. In addition to being a big Pittsburgh sports fan, Lance was also a huge LeBron James fan, so he wanted to see him play one time live, and I talk about live sports, so there you go again, coming full circle on this show. Lance did get out there in his weakened state with his mom, with his dad, with his brother, and his sister-in-law, and they went to go see LeBron James play. And I like to think that LeBron had a feeling that Lance was in the house. The Lakers took care of him. So many of these sports teams that Lance followed, they provided seats, they provided access to the players away from the fields of competition, in addition to getting great seats there. So I applaud all these organizations that helped make Lance's years on this earth better for him, more enjoyable, and he always told me he enjoyed talking sports with me. So it was humbling to be part of it. It was my honor to be part of it, and I'm sorry to hear that he passed away this past Friday. So sorry about that. Emotional for me, and I barely even knew the guy. I knew the young man. So, Lance, if you're out there, I know you love this week. Steelers beat the Pats. You were not expecting that. I know we were pretty pessimistic, you and I, about the Steelers season. And, well, the Pens beating the Caps never gets old for a Penguins fan. So, even though you're not here, if you are watching from somewhere, I know you were cheering just as loud as always for your two favorite teams. So, here's to you, Lance Fry. It was great to know you, and I suppose I'll see you when I see you, like I always told you, whenever we would say goodbye, whenever I would visit you there at Children's. So, ending on a somber note, but a positive note, like I said. A big week for the Pittsburgh sports teams, and like I said, sports not only lifts up those of us who are fortunate enough to have great health and everything going for us, but also those who are disadvantaged in whatever way. So, sports is a force for good. That's what I like to talk about on this show, and that's how I'll close this week's program. That's my last show of 2018. Didn't get to a couple of other topics, but I'm sure I'll have some time. As 2018 opens up, and God willing, I'll be back with you in the new year on Friday, January the 4th. So have a great holiday season if you haven't already started celebrating, and I will see you on the other side. For Brian Crawford, this is Matt Geiger reminding you that when the radio fades, you know life's moving fast. God bless, and see you soon. See you in the new year.